In a small workshop off the main hangar line, an Australian in his late 20s is unpacking tools at his feet. Handmade tools, and these are things that he turned on his own lathe in Sydney. Wrenches sized for the bolts he knew. Taps and dies he'd cut himself because the imported sets didn't have the right thread he needed. The kind of tools a mechanic makes when he spends a decade working in places where the parts don't always come easy. He was not on paper supposed to be there. The first thing he heard was an engine he didn't recognise. He'd spent 10 years listening to engines. He knew the Pratt & Whitney radials on the B-17s. He knew the Ellison V-12s and the P-40s. And he knew the Wright Cyclones and the Douglas transporters. The thing he was hearing right now was lighter, higher pitched, and they were coming from the north. He went to the window. What he witnessed on that day was the second group of the first wave coming in low over the field. 51 Aichi dive bombers turning into their attack runs with the gleam of A60s above them. He saw the line of B-17s on the apron that he had been working on for the last 4 months. He saw off to the right, past the hangars, the oil smoke already rising from Battleship Row, where the Nakajima Kates were doing their work on the moored ships. On one of those ships, the Utah, were the men he had been drinking with the night before. A Zero comes across the workshop on a strafing run. The cowling-mounted Type 97 machine guns of an A6M0 commence firing. 2 of those rounds went through the side of the footlocker. The man survived the morning. The footlocker survived the war. 85 years later, it sits on the floor of his grandson's living room in the southern hemisphere, still bearing the scars of the A6M0s. And the man who would tell you what was inside it carried the rest of what happened that day for the next 57 years under the strictest instruction to never tell a soul who didn't carry the right clearance. He was born March 1919, an only child. Now, in Australia of his generation, that mattered. It meant his mother Lily could build her hopes on the only son military exemption to keep the son out of the coming war. He left school at 16 to turn wrenches at Ansett Airways. A photograph of those years show him in coveralls, proud, standing in front of the Southern Cross. Now, the Southern Cross was a holy relic of Australian aviation. You didn't get the opportunity to stand in front of the aircraft casually. You stood there because you worked on it, and someone took your photograph on a day that mattered. Australia was thousands of miles away from the factories, and parts were scarce. The young man became the kind of mechanic who stayed after hours to mill parts himself out of raw stock. His workmanship was exact. His hands turned parts consistently, outlasting the originals. He was bullish, precise. He hated to lose. It was that same quiet determination he used to win over a woman that he would later marry in October 1940. In late May 1940, he was pulled off the tools. Waiting in his supervisor's office, an American flanked by 2 RAAF officers told him to take a seat, and the door was closed. We don't know what was asked. The file doesn't say. What we know is what happened next. On June 27th, the RAAF initiated an urgent inquiry through the New South Wales Police Commissioner, including a military police intelligence check for political affiliations. That clearance screening is for sensitive duties alone. A month later, his enlistment offer arrives, and it specifies a daily pay rate of 10 shillings. That figure is the load-bearing detail of this entire story. Sit with it for a moment. In 1940, an aircraftman first class, the rank stamped on the man's letter, earned 5 shillings a day. 10 shillings was the sergeant's rate. He was offered 2 full classifications above his stated rank before he had even been trade tested. The military does not overpay by 100% by accident. You do not draw a sergeant's wage against an aircraftsman's badge by clerical error. The system had decided that the young man would be paid for what he was actually doing, while the file itself provided the cover. Now, when his mother tried to pull him out using the only son exemption, the refusal came right from the very top of the RAAF. On August 5th, he enlisted under the Permanent Forces stamp, the standing professional cadre for which the highest specialists were drawn. And on the deployment day photograph taken just months later, you see his chevrons. On the outside, he is wearing a standard RAAF tropical embarkation jacket. This was strictly issued to aircraftmen leaving Australia for warm theatre service. The pattern is right, the wear is right, the cuts, the pockets, the buttons, the integral cloth belt, all of it. It's the kit of the RAAF airman, worn when he was leaving Australia for somewhere hot. According to his file, the young man never went anywhere that required it. He's wearing a tropical embarkation dress. For tropical theatre he was never deployed to. Now, look underneath. The shirt is light cotton. The RAAF wore dark blue wool service shirts in 1940-41. This isn't one of those. The tie is dark, the same tone as the inner coat. Pushing past the jacket cuffs, you can see the sleeves of an inner service coat in chocolate olive wool. The cuff is plain, no decorations, no piping. The simple cuff of an enlisted service tunic. The RAAF wasn't wearing that colour, or that cut, in early 1941. He's wearing a United States Army enlisted service dress under an Australian jacket on the day he left for Hawaii. The pay rate is sergeant, the chevron sergeant, and the role he was deploying to instructing US Army mechanics at Hickam Field demanded sergeant rank as an operational flaw. An aircraftman teaching American line chiefs would not have survived the room. In Washington 1940, the United States Army Air Corps had a problem, and the problem had a name: Major General George Howard Brett. Brett ran the Material Division. He understood that the next war wouldn't be won by the men in the cockpits, but by the men who could keep the aircraft flying. Factory pipelines were optimized for new aircraft. Once the shooting started, spare parts would take months to cross oceans filled with submarines. Brett needed mechanics who could read damaged aircraft the way a doctor reads a patient, and he was looking for them quietly. His office had a term for what was coming: field expedient marriage. You take the serviceable wing from one type and mate it to the fuselage of another. You hand splice the wiring. You fabricate the mounting hardware on a lathe. When you are finished, you have an aircraft that shouldn't exist. And the men on the line had a name for these aircraft: Frankensteins. American engineers hated this work. It went against everything the engineering school taught. It violated factory specifications that couldn't be certified. But in Australia, during this time, where apart from the US or England was always 6 months away, there were mechanics who had spent their life doing exactly this. They treated the airframe as a problem to be solved. Brett didn't just need their hands, he needed their philosophy. The American on that day recruiting the young man at Mascot was recruiting under Brett's orders. By the middle of 1941, the young engineer was at Hickam. Here he becomes the ghost. The base didn't officially employ him. What he walked into wasn't a base under peacetime. It was a base under quiet pressure. Of the 234 aircraft assigned in Hawaii that summer, only 146 were in commission. 88 airframes, more than a third of America's largest overseas deployment, was already grounded. They were waiting for parts that weren't coming. The aircraft hadn't been broken by the war. The war for the US hadn't started. They'd been broken by everything else. Wrecks dragged in from training accidents, carrier aircraft worn past their service life, Pacific weather, hard usage, the kind of damage that accumulates on aircraft pushed hard. By July of 1941, the US had cut oil exports to Japan. Brett's people in Washington knew that the attack was looming for somewhere in the Pacific. They also knew that the new aircraft being shoved out to Hawaii by carrier, the P-40s, the P-36s and the B-17s, were arriving faster than the maintenance pipeline could keep them flying. Spare parts from Seattle and Buffalo took months to cross the water. By the time they arrived, more aircraft were broken. The answer Brett had been working on for 18 months was a chop shop. That was where the ghost worked. Aircraft that should have been written off instead of resurrected with mismatched parts, hand-spliced harnesses and custom bolts turned on a lathe. A wing from one type, fuselage for another, harnesses rerouted by hand because the factory looms didn't match, mounting hardware fabricated overnight from raw stock. By the morning of December 7, 1941, there were a number of aircraft on the Hickam apron that didn't match any blueprint on Earth. They were flight tested, they were fueled, and anticipating the rising tension in the Pacific, they were loaded with ammunition. One of them, unknowingly, belonged to him. At 8:40, the second wave hit Hickam. The American pilots were either dead, wounded, or pinned down on the wrong side of the base. The aircraft that could still fly were the Frankensteins. The Ghost had been working on them and test flying them for months. Mechanics of that era didn't just absorb flight by riding right-hand seat. They commonly flew the aircraft themselves. He knew exactly how these specific planes handled, because he was the one who built them. As he told his grandson decades later, back then, health and safety was just common sense. So while the runway cratered and the strafing runs continued, an Australian who was officially not there climbs into an aircraft that officially didn't exist and pushes the throttle forward. He wasn't the only one in the air who shouldn't have been there. The historical records caught a few of their names: civilian flying instructors who happened to have time in the air before the second wave, light aircraft pilots taking fire over Kahuku Point. But the ones with the names in the records were real civilians. They weren't carrying Foreign Services pay, a Foreign Services rank, or a confidential file in Canberra that would still be sealed 85 years later. The Ghost never told his grandson how many zeros he engaged. He never said how many he brought down. He only said that when he finally climbed out of the cockpit, the hatred had already locked in, and it stayed with him for the next half-century. The Pacific War lasted 4 more years. Where the Ghost actually was, the file does not say. The file claims he was at Bankstown holding a unit for 2 solid years, with no logged movements. The file says that when his mother applied again for the only son discharge in 1944, that headquarters once again refused. And when the records issued his statement of service over the next 30 years, the file said he had no overseas service. What is clear is the file says many things that are not true. He came home to his wife, he was 4 kilos lighter, with a tan that didn't come from an Australian summer, and a quietness in his hands that had never been there before. He went back to civilian work. He raised a family. He built a house with his own hands. Every joint and cut finished by a man who spent a war keeping bombers in the air, and wasn't about to let a doorframe defeat him. He didn't speak about the war. He didn't march on Anzac Day. He didn't join the Return Services Leagues. His medals were never brought out for show. The footlocker went into the back of the garage, and he didn't open it for 53 years. For that period, he carried his experience alone. It's the late 1980s. They're out for a meal with their son and grandchildren. An older Japanese couple were seated at a table close. At this point in his life, the Ghost had held strong views about the Japanese that he wasn't bothered to soften in public. The Japanese man across the restaurant heard it. He could have said nothing. He could have stood up and left. He could have complained to the waiter. But instead, he stood up, walked across the restaurant to the Ghost's table, stopped beside him and offered him a few words. Something that wasn't anger. He'd been a pilot, he said. Imperial Japanese, Zeros, the Pacific. The two men didn't fight. They sat down together and began a conversation that had been waiting for them for half a century. A few years later, the Ghost moved to Surfers Paradise. Now, Surfers Paradise is the equivalent to Fort Lauderdale or Boca Raton. He purchased a house in Runaway Bay on the Gold Coast. It's populated with retirees. And across the road, in a house facing his, the former Zero pilot and his wife moved in. I don't know which one of them picked the suburb first, but what I do know is that for the last few decades of their lives, two men who were trying to kill each other across the Pacific in 1941 were not just neighbours, they became best friends. In all the years they spent across the road from each other, they never, after that conversation in the restaurant in the 80s, ever spoke about war again. They didn't compare stories. They didn't ask each other how many men they'd killed. They didn't dig through the shared history for the moments they'd both been in the same sky together. That was the reconciliation. No confession, no apology required. Two old men, both whom had done things they were not authorized to speak about, choosing to spend the last chapter of their lives in each other's company, and never once asking the other to explain himself. The other thing the ghost did around the same time was walk into a flight school. At 70 years old, this is not something many retirees do. He'd never held a pilot's license, and on paper, he'd never flown an aircraft in his life. Yet when he arrived there, he had already read the flight manual cover to cover. He had a working knowledge of the E6B, mechanical flight computer. The circular slide rule military pilots use in the Second World War. This was used to calculate wind correction, ground speed, fuel burn, and time to station. Now this device isn't a device for hobbyists. It's not something you pick up and learn yourself. Over the next couple of months, he flew the standard general aviation circuit, the cross-countries, the stalls, and lastly, he completed the standard examination and passed with flying colours. He drove home with a piece of paper in his pocket that for the first time in his life said he was officially permitted to do the one thing his service file didn't record him doing. In a discussion with the grandson, the instructor told him it was the most bizarre experience of his career. In 2009, the ghost's grandson stood on the base. He had come to spread the ashes of the ghost's closest American friend. They had no surviving family. The man in the urn was one of the lucky ones to survive. He had served on the Utah, sunk on the morning of the 7th of December 1941. The friendship between him and the ghost had been formed the night before, and that friendship lasted decades. The base access itself was highly secure. A non-dignitary Australian granted on the strength of duty owed to two men who themselves were veterans of that day. While he was there, he spoke about the story his grandfather shared with him 12 years earlier to a ranking veteran on the base and showed him a photo. The veteran's response was eerie at best.
I drank with him a lot.
Beyond that, he didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He connected to a memory of a man on that base 68 years earlier. The grandson carried those words home, and has carried those for the last 17 years. There's a story that's passed around Hickam in the way that myths survive at old war bases. It says that David Lee Hill, the famous Flying Tiger Triple Ace, was there on the morning of December 7th. He wasn't. Tex Hill himself stated that he arrived in Rangoon in September 1941. But mistaken identity in military folklore works in a specific way. The surviving men at Hickam had a memory of a young man who spoke differently, yet wore a US Army Air Corps uniform, and apparently was operating under a cover identity because he wasn't supposed to be there. They never did get his real name. So over the decades, the famous name of Tex Hill got pinned to that memory, simply because no other name fit the profile. This person was somebody that they drank with on the weekends, and they didn't drink with Tex Hill. The man they drank with isn't on any file the public has ever seen. When the ghost's grandson finally pulled the file at the National Archives, he didn't just see the record, he saw the years that weren't there. He saw the cover sheets of a confidential personnel sub-file with the contents stripped out. He saw a posting cancelled and replaced on the same day in January 1941. He saw 2 refused only son discharge applications. He saw a 1978 Veterans Affairs request. Now, this is a routine pension application that somehow had been inexplicably routed through the Defence Information Analysis Centre before it even reached the Air Force records. The grandson had worked in intelligence. He knew what a fabricated file looked like because he had penned them himself. He looked at the paper postings to Bankstown and did the math. He looked at the letter from the ghost's so-called previous employer, and none of it added up. A young man commuting 190 miles a day for a job that barely covered his travel costs was a logistical fiction. He looked at the family photograph with the sergeant chevrons. He looked at the substantive sergeant pay rate on the enlistment offer, and he knew from the operational reality of Hickam Field that sergeant was the flaw. 3 independent ledgers, 3 separate authorities, the same rank on the same man on the same day. The personnel records alone recorded a very ordinary man, but accounting never lies. The personnel record was the document being managed. 85 years after, the ghost was paid a sergeant's wage against an aircraftsman's badge. 85 years after the morning at Hickam. 85 years after the footlocker took 2 7.7mm rounds, matching that of an A6M0, the file still remains sealed. It has been kept closed by a system that has long since opened the files of pilots, codebreakers, and special operations personnel. In April 1998, the ghost sat in his lounge opposite his grandson, a 20-year-old early in his own intelligence service career. Between them sat a footlocker. The ghost pointed to it and said to his grandson, "There are things that I wish I was able to tell somebody. I am sharing it now with you because of the weight you are about to carry for the rest of your life." And 57 years later, the ghost finally told the events of that fateful day in 1941. His only instruction: do not talk about this until I am gone. Today that footlocker sits on the grandson's living room as a reminder, still bearing the 2 7.7mm holes. Inside still reside an early 1940s vintage book of matches from Trader Vic's in Oahu, a signal lamp painted in olive drab, a standard issue diary with 78 pages torn out. Only page 2 survives. It is penned in the ghost's own handwriting and reads, "This diary marks a journey to a place I am not supposed to exist. HAF 1941. All of these are evidence of a man who served in Oahu, a daily reminder of those who serve in the shadows. The ghost was paid as a sergeant. He wore sergeant stripes. Only the managed personnel file says aircraftman first class, because the personnel file was the document the state preserves for peacetime. The file on the ghost, still sealed to this day, is the ultimate proof that a different man existed. The state does not classify the records of ordinary mechanics for 85 years. The torn pages are the exact signature of an intelligence branch sanitizing something post-mission. Think about what that means for the history that you've been taught. We are conditioned to believe that the archive is the final authority, that if it isn't the official record, it didn't happen. But an intelligence file isn't a history book. It's a management tool. The real history of the world is rarely written in ink. More often it's written in the silences. It lives in the friction between a clean cover story and the messy, physical evidence that is left behind. The blank pages in the diary aren't an absence of truth. They are the exact shape of it. If you only ever read what the system authorizes you to read, you will never see the ghosts who actually built the world. Thanks for joining me here today. And remember, they rely on you forgetting, on you clicking away. Don't do it. Go deeper down the rabbit hole with this next video. And to make sure the signal can find you again, join the network click subscribe here and keep the light alight. This is Thinkavarium.